The Vikings, often thought of as fierce, brutal warriors who raided villages with abandon, were also a culture deeply rooted in ritual and spirituality. While their battles are famous, their rituals are just as fascinating and far stranger than you might think. From the concept of fate to connecting with the gods, these rituals weren't just traditions, but vital practices for survival. But here's the thing, many of these rituals aren't what you expect. They defy the typical portrayal of the Vikings as just savage warriors. Take blood sacrifices, for example. You might picture them as horrific, gruesome acts, but there's far more to these rituals than meets the eye. The Vikings believed that offering blood, whether from animals or in some rare cases humans, was a way to appease the gods and alter fate itself. These weren't random acts of brutality. They were done with purpose and intention. A Viking warrior's fate could hinge on these offerings. There's a surprising twist in this ancient ritual that will challenge your assumptions about Viking brutality and show you a more complex side of their beliefs. The connection between blood sacrifices and Viking spirituality was rooted in their perception of life and death, and how both were intricately tied to the gods' will. The concept of fate was central to the Viking worldview. They believed that their actions, no matter how grand or small, were guided by unseen forces. Blood sacrifices then were seen as a way to forge a connection with these forces. Whether it was sacrificing animals or even humans in extreme cases, the act of shedding blood was thought to influence the gods, ensuring victory, fertility, or prosperity. But here's the most surprising part. These sacrifices weren't necessarily as brutal as you might think. While Hollywood often depicts Viking rituals as violent, blood-soaked affairs, the reality is that these acts of sacrifice were often ceremonial and carefully controlled. The people involved in the rituals were not always unwilling victims. Sometimes those who volunteered for the sacrificial rites believed that by offering their life or blood, they were ensuring their passage into a better afterlife, or securing their place among the gods. In fact, the Vikings weren't as savage as popular culture portrays them. While their rituals were intense, they were also deeply spiritual. The blood sacrifices were part of a larger understanding of life, death, and the supernatural. The Vikings believed that the gods played a direct role in determining their fate, and these offerings were a way to align themselves with the gods' favor. This connection to fate wasn't just an abstract concept for the Vikings. It was woven into every aspect of their lives, from their daily routines to their most significant battles. And it's this deep spiritual framework that guided the Viking warriors through their most difficult moments, especially on the battlefield. They didn't simply fight for survival. They fought because they believed the gods were watching, guiding them, and that their actions had the power to alter the very course of their destiny. What's also fascinating is that these rituals weren't restricted to the warrior class alone. The Vikings as a whole participated in these acts of worship, whether they were on the battlefield, in their homes, or at community gatherings. Every Viking had a role to play in these rituals. The common folk would join in feasts, sacrifices, and festivals to honor the gods, while the warriors prepared for battle with the belief that their victory was a direct result of the gods' favor. But there's something even more unexpected about these rituals. They weren't just for the warriors. The Vikings believed that even the smallest offerings, whether it was a simple prayer or a food offering, had the power to shift the balance of fate. They viewed the world as interconnected, where every action had a ripple effect on the larger cosmic order. So even something as seemingly simple as a sacrifice of grain or the blood of a goat had the potential to influence the course of events. What's truly strange about these Viking blood sacrifices is that the practice, while based on a deep belief in the gods' power, wasn't just about the gods. It was also about the Vikings' relationship with each other. These rituals were bonding experiences. When a warrior offered his blood in sacrifice, it wasn't just an offering to the gods. It was a way to bond with his comrade. This practice helped foster unity and collective purpose, ensuring that the warriors fought not only for themselves but for their brothers in arms. Viking blood sacrifices were a method of shaping destiny, forging a path that could lead to greatness, prosperity, and a place in the afterlife. And while these rituals may seem brutal or strange from a modern perspective, they were an essential part of Viking life, reflecting their deeply held beliefs about fate, the gods, and the interconnectedness of life and death. These practices were about more than just appeasing the gods. They were about understanding and influencing the forces that shape their world. So, what does this all mean for our understanding of the Vikings? It challenges the commonly held belief that they were mindless savages only interested in war and plunder. It shows us a side of Viking culture that is both deeply spiritual and connected to a worldview that was far more complex than we often give them credit for. The rituals, especially the blood sacrifices, were a means to connect with the gods, to influence fate, and to ensure a place in the afterlife. It's a reminder that the Vikings, despite their warrior image, were people who believed in the power of rituals to shape their lives and the world around them. But the story doesn't end here. There are many more surprising Viking rituals that might change the way you think about them. From mysterious rites to unexpected practices, the Vikings were far more than the warriors we often see in movies. Stay tuned as we uncover even more strange and fascinating rituals that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about Viking culture. You've probably seen a Viking drinking horn before, maybe in movies or worn by someone at a medieval reenactment. But what's the real story behind it? Was it just a tool for drinking, or did it hold a deeper, more spiritual meaning? The Viking drinking drinking horn wasn't simply an object for feasting. It was integral to some of the most sacred rituals within Viking society. It bound warriors together, invoked the gods, and prepared them mentally for the battles ahead. Before every major battle, warriors would gather, holding the horn as a symbol of unity. They would drink from it, and it wasn't just a simple gesture of camaraderie. It was a ritual meant to invoke the god of war, a force that would fight by their side on the battlefield. The act of drinking from the horn was far more than celebration. It was the final mental and spiritual preparation before heading to war. Now here's the twist. What if I told you that the meaning of this horn went far beyond the idea of it being just a drinking vessel? What you probably don't know is that these horns held immense symbolic value. They were crafted from the horns of cattle or other animals, not just for their physical utility, but because the Vikings believed that the animal's spirit was transferred into the horn. This connection between the physical horn and the spiritual energy it carried wasn't just folklore. It was part of a profound belief system where the Vikings saw every object in their environment as spiritually charged. When they drank from the horn, they believed they were not only physically preparing themselves for battle, but also connecting with the ancient forces that guided them. You might be surprised to know that these drinking horns were also a part of social rituals. In a Viking community, it wasn't just the warriors who used these horns. They were often passed around during feasts or gatherings. The drink that flowed from the horn was believed to carry the blessings of the gods, uniting not just the warriors but the whole community. The shared drink from the horn meant the sharing of fate, and it was seen as a way to strengthen bonds between the people, their gods, and their shared destiny. But there's an even more surprising layer to these horns. Beyond being a tool for invoking gods and bonding with comrades, these horns were often elaborately decorated with symbols and runes. They weren't just functional, they were objects of power. Runes carved into the horn were thought to imbue the drinker with certain qualities, like strength, courage, or protections. This added an extra dimension to the ritual. By drinking from the horn, the Vikings believed they were activating these qualities within themselves. It wasn't just about getting drunk, it was about receiving the strength of their gods. Here's the kicker. Many people think of Vikings as being all about violence and bloodshed, but the truth is that the horn ritual was just as much about mental preparation as it was about physical prowess. The Vikings knew that to succeed in battle, a warrior needed a clear mind, a sense of unity, and the spiritual backing of the gods. These horns were designed to bring those elements together in a single unified act. Drinking from the horn wasn't just about putting liquid in their bodies, it was about putting purpose and power into their soul. A deeper connection between the drinking horn and Viking unity will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about Viking culture. Sure, they were fearsome warriors, but they were also a people who believed that every action they took had a spiritual weight, that every battle was not just fought with strength but with the will of the gods. It wasn't just the swords or shields that protected them in battle, it was their belief that they had the gods at their side, influencing every outcome. Here's a fun fact that might blow your mind. While today the drinking horn is often associated with drunken revelry, the Vikings used it for more than just a quick sip of ale. The rituals surrounding the horn were steeped in purpose and meaning. The idea that you could drink to invoke divine favor, to prepare for battle, or to unite a community under one shared destiny was core to their spiritual worldview. Most people think of Vikings as mindless raiders, yet they had this complex and profound spiritual system that informed everything they did. When they held their drinking horns, they were holding more than just an object. They were holding the potential to change their fate. It was a magical vessel that tied them to their gods, their ancestors, and their future victories. In essence, the horn was a bridge between the mortal world and the divine. What's even more fascinating is how the drinking horn was used in Viking feasts, not just as part of a battle preparation, but as part of a larger cultural and social ritual. At feasts, the horn wasn't just a vessel for alcohol. It was a means to celebrate unity, honor the gods, and mark important life events. Either it was the crowning of a new leader or a moment of triumph, the horn was passed among the guests, reinforcing the bond between the individuals and the community. So, the next time you see a Viking drinking horn, you'll know that it's much more than just a decorative piece. It's a symbol of their spiritual beliefs, a vessel that carried both the divine and the mundane, a tool used not just for drinking but for calling down the power of the gods. The Vikings, often seen as only brutal warriors, were in fact a people who deeply understood the power of ritual and the importance of unity, both in battle and in life. Their drinking horns weren't just for a drink, they were for shaping the course of history, and the deeper meaning behind the horn ritual is just the beginning. There are even more surprising Viking rituals that will change the way you view these legendary warriors. Stick around as we continue to unravel the mysteries of Viking spirituality, where every act had a divine purpose and every ritual was a step toward shaping fate. What comes next will challenge everything you think you know about Viking culture. You've probably heard of the Berserkers, the legendary Viking warriors who fought in a trance-like fury, seemingly unstoppable on the battlefield. But what you may not know is how they entered this frenzied state. It wasn't just about rage, it was a carefully crafted ritual, a process of mental and physical transformation that involved both preparation and spiritual connection. It wasn't pure madness, it was a deep, almost mystical experience that connected them to the ancient spirits they believed gave them power. Before every battle, the Berserkers would go through this intense ritual. Imagine warriors, dressed in animal skins and holding their weapons, preparing not just their bodies but their very minds for the chaos ahead. They didn't simply charge into battle with blind anger. The ritual began with intense physical exertion, sometimes running, other times engaging in intense combat training, or even meditative practices to clear the mind. They weren't just gearing up physically but mentally and spiritually. This was a transformation, a shedding of their human limitations, allowing them to embody the strength and spirit of the beasts they associated themselves with. The process was steeped in the belief that the Berserkers were channeling ancient primal spirits. But here's the thing, what if I told you that it wasn't just about spirit possession? The Berserkers believed that the spirits they invoked could give them the strength to become invincible in battle. This wasn't just superstition, it was a deeply spiritual practice. They believed that the spirit of the bear, wolf, or other creatures could give them the power to ignore pain and fear, to fight with the fury of a wild animal, and to stand against the odds in a way no regular warrior could. But there's a catch. What most people don't know is that these Berserker rituals weren't always as wild as they seemed. There was a deep spiritual component that balanced the ferocity. Before entering battle, Berserkers would often engage in chants, rituals, and even drink special concoctions believed to heighten their abilities. They weren't just throwing themselves into a mindless rage. They were invoking ancient power, asking the spirits for guidance and strength. They were preparing their minds and spirits to be warriors on another level, allowing them to channel their fury in a controlled, purposeful way. You might be surprised to learn that the Berserkers didn't always fight alone. The ritual wasn't just about transforming the individual, it was also about creating unity within their group. These rituals were done together as a way to forge a connection among the warriors, to make them stronger as a collective. Imagine a group of Berserkers chanting and focusing together, their energy building and amplifying as they prepared to face the enemy. They were not just individuals, they were a unified force, strengthened by their shared spiritual connection and their shared fury. In fact, the Berserker ritual was closely tied to the belief in fate. The Vikings had a deep respect for the concept of fate, and they believed that every action, every battle, and every ritual had a purpose in the grand tapestry of life. The Berserkers believed that by invoking the ancient spirits and preparing themselves in this sacred way, they were aligning themselves with the will of the gods. Their victories were not just the result of their own strength, they were a direct outcome of divine favor and spiritual power. Now, here's a strange fact that might make you rethink everything you know about the Berserkers. While we often think of Berserkers as wild, frothing at the mouth warriors, they actually had a code of conduct. They weren't just mindlessly attacking anything in their path. In fact, they were often among the most disciplined warriors. Yes, they were known for their fury and fearlessness, but they also followed strict rituals to enter their Berserker state. This balance between wild fury and controlled discipline was what made them so terrifying on the battlefield. But the Berserkers weren't the only ones who engaged in these intense spiritual rituals. Many Viking warriors believed that the power to fight effectively came not just from training, but from the gods themselves. And the Berserker ritual in many ways exemplifies the Viking view of the supernatural, that it was not just a belief, but a tangible force that could be harnessed. Whether it was the strength of the bear, the cunning of the wolf, or the power of the gods themselves, the Vikings believed that invoking these forces was key to ensuring success in battle. What might surprise you even more is the fact that the Berserker ritual was also used as a way to influence their fate in battle. The Vikings didn't believe that fate was fixed. They believed that through the right rituals, they could alter their destiny. By invoking the spirits and preparing their minds, they believed they could influence the outcome of their battles. This belief in the power of rituals and the gods was something that shaped the very fabric of Viking society. Here's where it gets really interesting. The Berserker ritual wasn't just a means of preparing for battle. It was also about personal transformation. The Berserkers weren't just fighting for their tribe. They were fighting to prove their own worth, to prove that they could channel the power of the gods. In their minds, every battle was a test of their spiritual strength, their connection to the divine, and their place in the world. To fight like a Berserker was to transcend human limitations, to become something greater than oneself. And that's a powerful idea. But there's a twist you may not expect. What if I told you that the Berserkers weren't always the invincible warriors they're made out to be? Some historians believe that the Berserker frenzy could be triggered by more than just spiritual power. It might have been fueled by hallucinogenic substances. Some evidence suggests that they might have used mushrooms or other substances to enhance their state of fury. This raises the question, were they tapping into something supernatural, or were they simply altering their minds to achieve the same result? This aspect of the Berserker ritual opens up a whole new debate about the line between the spiritual and the psychological. Were the Berserkers truly connected to the divine forces, or were they simply using the power of the mind and body in a highly controlled ritualistic way? The truth is, it could have been a mix of both. The ritual itself was deeply spiritual, but the physical and psychological components might have played just as big a role in the Berserkers' transformation. The link between Berserkers and the supernatural is far more complex than most people realize. What you've learned today is just the beginning of understanding the real power behind the Berserker Ritual. It wasn't just about rage or the strength of the warriors. It was about invoking the power of the gods, connecting with ancient spirits, and changing their very destiny. The Berserkers were not just savage warriors. They were men who believed they could transform themselves into gods, using rituals and the power of fate to shape the course of their battles. This connection to the supernatural and the complex rituals that shaped their transformations is a part of Viking life that you may never have imagined. But the story of the Berserkers doesn't end here. Stay tuned as we continue to uncover more surprising and mysterious rituals that will change the way you think about Viking culture. You might have seen Viking funerals depicted in movies or heard stories about them, but do you truly understand their significance? The Viking funeral was not simply a way to dispose of the dead. It was a deeply sacred ritual that served multiple purposes. Funerals were designed to honor the deceased, ensure a safe journey to the afterlife, and even serve as a social and political statement. It wasn't just about saying goodbye. It was about preparing the soul for its next journeys. But there's more to these funerals than meets the eye. Viking funerals were elaborate, highly ritualistic events that involved careful preparation of the body and significant cultural ceremonies. The body was washed, adorned in the deceased's finest clothing, and often surrounded by objects that they believed would be useful in the afterlife. This could include weapons, jewelry, and sometimes even food and drink. The Vikings believed that these items would help the dead transition smoothly to the world of the gods. What makes Viking funerals even more fascinating is their social function. These events weren't just a private matter. They were often a grand public spectacle. The scale of the funeral could reflect the social status of the deceased. High-ranking warriors, kings, or chiefs would have funerals that could involve entire communities, with feasts, sacrifices, and rituals. The funeral was a way to reinforce social bonds and showcase the power of the deceased. Even in death, the deceased's warriors and family would be expected to participate in these rituals, often through chants and songs that would honor their deeds in life. What might surprise you, however, is that some Viking funerals involved fire and even shit. It's an image that has been popularized in the media, but the truth behind this practice is even more fascinating than what we see in movies. Vikings believed that setting a boat aflame and sending it out to sea with the deceased aboard would ensure their soul's safe journey to the afterlife. The fire symbolized purification, burning away any earthly attachments to prepare the soul for its final destination. The boat itself was symbolic too, representing a passage to the unknown. But while this boat funeral imagery is iconic, it was not the most common form of Viking funeral. In many cases, a simpler burial or cremation was performed. However, the idea of sending someone out to sea was a very real and deeply spiritual practice that demonstrated the Vikings' understanding of death and the afterlife. But why a ship? The Viking worldview was one where travel and exploration were central. The sea wasn't just a physical boundary, it was a symbolic one. It represented both the literal journey to the afterlife and the spiritual voyage to another realm. For the Vikings, being sent out to sea in a ship was one of the highest honors they could bestow upon the dead. Viking funerals were also incredibly symbolic in the way they reflected the beliefs about the afterlife. To the Vikings, death wasn't an end, but a continuation of a journey. Warriors believed they would be taken to Valhalla, the hall of the slain, if they died in battle. This was the ultimate honor, a reward from Odin himself. The funeral rituals were designed to ensure that the deceased would be received by the gods and granted a place in this eternal hall. The funeral rites, from the body preparation to the offerings and sacrifices, were believed to influence this final judgment. But here's the strange fact that will challenge what you might have thought about Viking funerals. Not all Vikings believed in Valhalla. While many saw this as their final resting place, others believed in different realms of the afterlife, like Hell, a cold and desolate land ruled by the goddess of the same name. This variation in beliefs shows that even in death, the Vikings had a diverse and complex view of the world beyond. The funerals weren't one size fits all. They were tailored to the individual's beliefs and status. You might also be surprised to learn that the funerals were also political and social events, reinforcing the structure of Viking society. The deceased's family or tribe would use the funeral to assert their power and status. Feasts, speeches, and tributes would often be part of the funeral, allowing the community to come together, celebrate the life of the deceased, and solidify their social position. The funeral wasn't just about the dead, it was about the living as well. What's even more surprising is that Viking funerals were a way to pass on knowledge and ensure the continuation of the tribe's legacy. During these events, stories about the deceased's life, their battles, and their achievements would be shared. This storytelling tradition was an important part of Viking culture, as it ensured that the deeds of the dead would be remembered for generations to come. The funeral became a place where history was made and where a person's legacy was cemented. But there was an even darker side to Viking funerals. In some cases, the funeral rites included human sacrifice. While not as common as animal sacrifices, there are accounts that suggest that slaves, concubines, or warriors might be sacrificed to accompany the deceased to the afterlife. This practice was believed to ensure that the deceased would have servants or warriors to serve them in the afterlife. This gruesome practice is not something we typically associate with Viking funerals, but it was part of their belief system, reflecting their views on the afterlife and their commitment to appeasing the gods. What is truly unique about Viking funerals is the deep connection they had to the very essence of life and death. These rituals were were not just about mourning, they were about honoring the deceased, ensuring a successful transition to the afterlife, and reinforcing the community's strength and beliefs. It was a blend of spirituality, tradition, and social function that made these funerals so much more than just a burial or cremation. The Viking funerals reveal a lot about their culture. The way they prepared for death wasn't something morbid or depressing to them. It was a sacred ritual that reflected their beliefs about fate, the gods, and the afterlife. The funerals were an essential part of how they understood their place in the world, both during life and after death. So, next time you think of a Viking funeral, remember that it wasn't just a fiery boat drifting off to sea. It was a complex, deeply spiritual ritual that held significant meaning for the Vikings. A final rite that not only prepared the soul for the afterlife, but also strengthened the bonds of the living. But even with all of these ancient traditions, the Vikings had more surprises in store. Up next, we'll explore another fascinating and mysterious ritual that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about Viking culture. Stay tuned for more. Did you know that Vikings didn't just focus on fighting? They also had some deeply spiritual rituals that might surprise you. One of the most important of these was the practice of consulting seers for guidance. These mystical figures were far more integral to Viking life than many realized. Seers, also known as havovase, were revered in Viking society for their supposed ability to see into the future, communicate with spirits, and offer vital wisdom to leaders. Their role was so significant that kings and chiefs would often seek their guidance before making important decisions. They weren't just seen as mystics or fortune tellers, they were considered wise and powerful, as though they had the keys to the secrets of the universe. But here's where things get intriguing. Many of the rituals surrounding the seers weren't as straightforward as you think. The process of gaining insight into the future or the divine was often far more intense and immersive than we might imagine. These rituals weren't about simply asking a question. They were about creating an experience, one that could open a portal to another realm. The Vovas would often enter a trance-like state, induced by chanting or singing, in order to commune with the gods or spirits of the dead. This wasn't your typical seance scenario, where you might expect to contact a spirit in a passive way. Instead, these women would channel the gods, experience visions, and provide counsel to the living based on what they saw. These rituals often involved sacred objects, such as staffs or charms, that were believed to have special powers. The Vovas would often perform their work in secluded, sacred spaces like groves or temples. The connection between these places and the gods was so important that even the landscape played a role in ensuring the success of the ritual. But it wasn't just about the Vovas' personal abilities or the objects they used. The role of hallucinogens in these rituals is an aspect that many overlook. Vikings often used hallucinogenic substances, like mushrooms or herbs, as a means to enhance their spiritual experiences. These substances, believed to help the seers reach altered states of consciousness, were an essential part of the process. In these altered states, the Vovas could access realms beyond the physical world, communicate with spirits, and gain knowledge that the average person could never access. This might sound like something out of a fantasy novel, but for the Vikings, these practices were a way to connect with the divine. The idea that the future was written in the stars, that fate could be altered through spiritual guidance, was an essential part of their worldview. What's even more surprising is that these rituals didn't just involve women. While the Vovas were typically women, men also practiced forms of divination. The practice of aesadra, the magic that allowed for fate manipulation, was sometimes taught to male warriors or leaders, though it was considered taboo for them to practice it openly in some parts of Viking society. It's important to note that Viking spirituality was not as neatly compartmentalized as we might imagine. The gods weren't distant figures. They were intertwined with daily life, with fate, and with the cosmos itself. The seers, through their rituals, acted as the intermediaries between the gods and the people, guiding the Vikings through their toughest challenges. This deep connection to the gods shaped the way the Vikings approached life and death, war and peace, and everything in between. The fascinating thing about these rituals is that the Vikings didn't just use them for personal guidance. They were intertwined with political and social functions. Kings, warriors, and leaders would often consult seers before going into battle or making a major decision. The fate of the tribe and even the entire Viking society could hinge on the advice of a seer. In a world where survival was never guaranteed, the power of a seer to shift the tides of fate was not something to be taken lightly. Some Viking leaders, in fact, believed that the seers held power equal to or even greater than the warriors who fought on the front lines. But what might shock you is that despite the seers' importance, not all Viking societies viewed them in the same way. While seers were revered in many Viking tribes, in other areas they were viewed with suspicion. There were even instances of seers being persecuted, as their practices could be considered dangerous, especially when they revealed unpleasant truths or conflicted with the leadership's plans. The role of the seer wasn't always secure, and their power was often at the mercy of the political tides of the time. The fascinating intersection between politics, religion, and fate is key to understanding how Viking society worked. The very idea of fate itself, wordy, was integral to how they approached everything from battle strategies to family legacy. Vikings didn't see their lives as governed purely by chance. They believed in an interconnectedness that went beyond the physical world. Through rituals and magic, they sought to alter their fates, gain favor with the gods and ensure the prosperity of their people. Now, while we might consider these practices strange or even absurd in the modern world, it's important to remember that they were central to the Viking experience. The connection between religion, politics, and fate made the Vikings unique. The seer's ritual, though mystical, provided the guidance they believed necessary for survival in a hostile world. You might even find it strange to think that many of these rituals, particularly the use of hallucinogens, could have such a profound impact on the Viking worldview. The belief in altering fate through spiritual connection was so strong that it became embedded in their daily lives, in the decisions of their leaders, and even in the most mundane aspects of their existence. And this wasn't just about divination. This was about power, about control over destiny. What is particularly surprising is that these seers and their practices continue to inspire fascination today. Their rituals, their beliefs in the power of fate, and their connection to the gods reveal a deeply spiritual culture that saw the supernatural as part of their very being. As we dive deeper into Viking history, we begin to realize that the supernatural wasn't just part of the stories. They were the driving force behind the Vikings' very existence. The surprising truths behind these rituals will challenge everything you thought you knew about Viking society. Far more than just fierce warriors, the Vikings were a deeply spiritual people who believed that their destiny could be shaped by the gods, by the spirits, and by the mystical practices of their seers. These ancient rituals continue to captivate us because they offer a glimpse into a worldview that was both mystical and grounded in survival. But just wait, there's more to come. Next, we'll dive deeper into another strange and fascinating Viking ritual that will turn your expectations upside down. Stick with us as we explore even more of the Vikings' extraordinary and mysterious practices. You won't want to miss what's coming next. If you think Vikings were only about wild raids and battles, you're about to be surprised. There's one ritual that will turn everything you thought you knew upside down. The Ibluchog ritual. It was not just about warfare. It was about life itself, how they connected with their gods and ensured prosperity for their people. The Ublot was a sacred ritual that honored the gods, involving sacrifices and feasts. Now, you might think of a sacrifice as something grisly, something out of a horror movie, but it wasn't like that. Blot was about balance, about giving to the gods in order to receive their favor, ensuring the survival and prosperity of the community. It wasn't just a random act of violence, but a structured act of reverence and communication with the divine. The sacrifices were made in order to ensure good harvests, victory in battle, and protection for the tribe. But here's where it gets interesting. The Ublata could take place anywhere. It didn't always have to happen at a grand temple or a sacrificial site. Sometimes it took place in people's homes, with the entire community coming together to partake. These rituals were so deeply ingrained in Viking culture that they weren't limited to religious leaders. They were an act for everyone, and in some ways, an expression of unity and social responsibility. It wasn't just a religious duty, it was also a communal act that tied the people together. The Vikings didn't just sacrifice animals, they also believed that the gods needed their offerings to ensure the fertility of the land, the protection of the warriors, and the favor of the gods in their daily lives. But here's the twist. While they were offering sacrifices to the gods, they also invited outsiders to join in. Imagine that, strangers from other tribes or clans being invited to join in on a feast that involved the divine. It wasn't just about creating a boundary between us and them. It was about showing that unity, especially when it came to the gods, could transcend tribal lines. This act of inclusivity may sound odd, but it was a way of ensuring peace and demonstrating strength, that the Vikings could afford to welcome outsiders into their sacred rituals. Now, most people think that these rituals were purely about appeasing the gods for good fortune, but there's something more subtle going on here. They were deeply tied to fate, or wyrd, the concept of death. The act of giving, of sharing the offerings, was a way for the Vikings to influence the balance of fate. By offering something to the gods, they believed they could change the course of their lives and even manipulate their destinies. You might find this controversial, but this belief in altering fate through ritual sacrifice was so central to Viking society that it became embedded in every aspect of their lives. They believed that what they did in the present could directly influence their future, and it wasn't just about winning battles or gaining wealth. It was about ensuring the protection of their families, the continuity of their clan, and the preservation of their culture. The strange thing about the Ublot ritual is that it wasn't always about just pleasing the gods. There was also a very real political element to it. Viking leaders would often perform the ritual to cement their authority, to show that they were favored by the gods, and to display their strength in the eyes of their people. The feasts that followed the sacrifices weren't just celebratory, they were political acts, demonstrating that the leader was in touch with the divine, and therefore worthy of respect and loyalty. These rituals were integral to how Vikings maintained their social structure and political power, and the most surprising part, you might think that these sacrifices were grim affairs filled with fear, but the Yoblata rituals were often joyous celebrations. Yes, there was an offering to the gods, but there was also music, food, and dancing. It was a communal event, one where the gods were honored, but the people also celebrated the life they had together. It was a complex blend of reverence and revelry, a way to demonstrate their connection to the gods while reinforcing their bond with each other. But don't rush to conclusions just yet, there's more. The Ublot ritual wasn't just for show or to keep the gods happy. It had lasting consequences. It wasn't just about the here and now. now. It was about legacy, about creating a path for future generations. The sacrifice wasn't a one-time event. It was a long-term strategy to secure the survival and prosperity of the Vikings for years to come. This was a ritual tied to their identity as a people, a group that believed in the power of their community and their gods to shape their destiny. It wasn't just about one man or one tribe. It was about ensuring the continuity of Viking society. The more you think about it, the more fascinating it becomes. The Blood ritual was about far more than just appeasing gods or ensuring success in battle. It was about survival, legacy, and unity. The Vikings weren't just warriors. They were deeply spiritual people, connected to the land, to their gods, and to each other. This ritual was one of the many ways they kept their world intact and their destiny in their own hands. But don't think we've covered everything just yet. There's a lot more to uncover about Viking rituals and how they shape their world. Stay tuned, because we're about to dive into even deeper mysteries, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. You've probably heard of Viking women warriors, the Shield Maidens, but did you know their pre-battle rituals were as intense as the ones their male counterparts followed? These Shield Maidens weren't just mythic figures in sagas. They were real, trained fighters who took part in some of the most complex rituals in Viking culture. The Shield Maidens were believed to prepare for battle through a series of spiritual and physical rituals that earned them favor from the gods. These weren't your typical battle preparations. Unlike the Berserkers, who entered their trance-like states through ritual fury, the Shield Maidens engaged in mental preparation that focused on their connection to the divine and their role in Viking society. The spiritual side of these rituals might shock you. They weren't just preparing for combat. They were preparing for leadership. You might find it strange to think of Viking women as leaders, but the Shield Maidens were trained to lead. In a society where gender roles were often strictly defined, the role of these women defied convention. Shield Maidens were not only warriors, they were political figures too. While some might have been expected to take on supportive roles in the family or society, these women were taught to wield swords, lead troops, and earn the respect of their male counterparts. Their place in Viking society wasn't about filling traditional female roles, but about defining a new kind of leadership, one rooted in strength, faith, and honor. But what's even more fascinating, the connection between the Shield Maidens and the gods. These rituals were designed to ensure the gods' favor, but they were also about destiny, about shaping their fate before the battle began. Their rituals were deeply tied to the belief that one's actions could change the course of events. The Shield Maidens didn't just fight, they fought to fulfill their fate, to serve the gods, and to shape the future of their people. This connection to destiny was not just about martial prowess, it was about spirituality, and it guided their every action in battle. You might be surprised to learn that these rituals didn't end once the Shield Maidens entered the battlefield. They were expected to continue their rites during the battle itself. The Shield Maidens were seen as protectors, both of their people and of the sacred practices that the Vikings held so dear. Their focus and dedication to the gods set them apart from other warriors. To them, fighting wasn't just a job, it was a divine calling, and every battle was a way to prove their loyalty to the gods and to the land. Here's the kicker. The Shield Maidens weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for the legacy of Viking culture. They were integral to the spiritual, political, and social structure of their societies. While most people view Viking warriors as primarily men, the Shield Maidens revealed that Viking women were just as integral to the preservation and shaping of their culture as the men were. They were rituals they followed weren't just about personal honor. They were about securing the future of Viking society. But the most mind-blowing part of the Shield Maidens rituals, they were often portrayed as more than warriors. They were considered semi-divine figures, deeply intertwined with Viking mythology. These women weren't simply fulfilling the roles that society expected of them. They were embodying the gods themselves. Many Shield Maidens were believed to have been chosen by the gods to fight, not just for survival, but for the continuation of the world's spiritual balance. Their role in Viking mythology was essential, and their rituals, whether physical, spiritual, or both, were pivotal in ensuring that they fulfilled their destinies. You might think that these rituals were simply a way of showing respect to the gods, but they were much more than that. The Shield Maidens were representing the power of destiny, of fate, and of the Viking gods. Their rituals made them part of something far greater than themselves, a cause that transcended battle. They weren't just fighting for Viking power, they were fighting for the preservation of the spiritual world, and their place in it was defined by rituals that connected the physical and spiritual realms. These women may have seemed like mere warriors to some, but their role was far greater than that. Through their rituals, Shield Maidens were not just ensuring victory in battle, they were spiritual leaders, guiding their people through fierce times, while embodying the very principles that made the Vikings unique. What you might not know is that many historians believe that the Shield Maidens were also key in shaping Viking ideas about leadership. Their rituals, tied so deeply to both the spiritual and political spheres, were seen as the ideal form of leadership within Viking culture. And yet, despite this powerful influence, their roles have often been minimized or romanticized in modern depictions of Viking society. In truth, the Shield Maidens' pre-battle rituals were part of something bigger, a society that valued the connection between the physical world and the spiritual realm. Their practices, deeply rooted in Viking beliefs, show us that what we think we know about Viking society might not be the full story. These rituals weren't just practices for battle, they were rites that defined who the the shield maidens were and what they stood for. As you dive deeper into the world of Viking rituals, you'll find that these incredible women were just the tip of the iceberg. The deeper you look into Viking history, the more you realize how complex and spiritually rich their society truly was. The shield maidens weren't just warriors, they were the embodiment of Viking ideals, and their rituals are a window into a society that blended physical strength, spiritual depth, and a powerful sense of fate. You may have heard of the Blot Call chant, a war cry of the Vikings, but what if I told you that this chant wasn't just about boosting morale before battle? It was part of a mysterious ritual with profound spiritual meaning. The Blot Call was a sacred vocal invocation, used during sacrifices to call upon the gods for protection and victory. Picture this, a Viking ship setting sail, warriors gathered ready to face the unknown. Before they embarked on their dangerous journey, they would chant these words in unison, hoping to gain the favor of the gods. But here's the twist. The words of the chant weren't just arbitrary. They were believed to carry magical power, influencing the very outcome of battles. This ritual wasn't limited to just preparing the warriors for battle. It was about altering fate itself. Through these chants, the Vikings believed they could shape their destiny. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The real power behind these chants might not be as supernatural as you think. While most people would view this ritual as purely spiritual, it also had a psychological impact on the warriors, helping them focus and unify their intentions. In essence, the chant was as much about the mental state of the warriors as it was about invoking divine intervention. You might be thinking, this sounds like pure superstition, but the Vikings believed in the inherent power of language and sounds. The Blot Call chant wasn't just noise, it was a force that could influence reality. The Vikings' belief in the magical properties of speech reveals a fascinating layer of their spirituality. While it's easy to dismiss these rituals as primitive or fanciful, the Vikings were actually tapping into deep psychological and spiritual forces to prepare themselves for the brutal challenges of battle. This ritual was part of a larger Viking belief system that connected their actions directly to the fate of their society. The idea was simple but powerful. Speak the right words, and you could change the course of your destiny. It wasn't just about calling out to the gods for help. It was about affirming a warrior's purpose and aligning oneself with the cosmos. The Vikings were not passive in their beliefs. They actively shaped their future with every word, every chant, every action. You might find it fascinating to think that, in this way, the chant served as a form of mental conditioning. It helped the warriors shed their fear, embracing the chaos of battle with unwavering confidence. The sound of the chant, the rhythm of the words, acted as a unifying force, binding the warriors together in a shared purpose. And in that shared unity, they found strength. But here's the twist. While the power of the chant was immense, its effectiveness wasn't solely tied to the spiritual realm. Psychological studies today show how rituals, whether it's chanting or other forms of collective behavior, can boost group cohesion, focus, and individual performance. In that sense, the Blot Call chant wasn't just a ritual to call upon the gods. It was a way of fortifying the warriors' minds and preparing them for the hardships they were about to face. It's almost as if the Vikings were masters of combining mental discipline with spiritual belief. They knew that in order to succeed in battle, they needed not just the favor of the gods, but also a powerful mental state. The chant served as a tool to synchronize the minds of the warriors, creating a collective consciousness that could propel them to victory. It wasn't just about individual bravery, it was about creating a unified force, a spiritual and psychological army. This brings us to the significance of the Blot Call chant in Viking culture. It wasn't merely a means to an end, it was deeply woven into the fabric of their societal identity. From the moment they chanted together, they were reminded that they were part of something much larger than themselves. They were connected to the gods, their ancestors, and their fellow warriors. The chant symbolized the unity of the Viking people, reinforcing their shared beliefs and their unyielding desire to conquer both external enemies and internal doubts. The ritual wasn't just for battle either. It had a broader role in Viking society. The chant reinforced the idea that fate could be influenced by will and intention. Whether it was a battle, a raid, or a journey, the Blot Call was a reminder that nothing was left to chance. Every victory, every success was a result of divine favor, and the warrior's ability to align himself with that favor through ritual and will. What's even more surprising is how the chant was seen as a living thing, something that transcended the warriors themselves. The words were thought to resonate in the very air, carrying power with them. It almost like a prayer, but much more dynamic, something that actively shaped the world around them. Through this ritual, the Vikings demonstrated their belief that the universe was an interconnected, responsive place, where every word and action had consequences. And while we often think of the Vikings as brutal, savage warriors, their rituals, like the Blot Call chant, reveal a far more sophisticated worldview. They were not just people of action, they were spiritual strategists, using rituals and belief systems to help them navigate a world that seemed chaotic and unpredictable. Their practices were a way of gaining control over their circumstances, of bending fate to their will. The Blot Call chant is just one of many Viking rituals that show us how deeply spirituality and psychology were intertwined in their culture. The Vikings weren't just following rituals to appease gods, they were creating experiences that empowered them and gave them the mental fortitude to face challenges head-on. This unique blend of belief, psychology, and ritual will continue to reshape the way we think about the Viking mindset. They weren't just warriors, they were people who believed that every action, every word, every chant could change their fate. And that belief, no matter how it was grounded in superstition or reality, was a force to be reckoned with. Vikings didn't just drink to celebrate, they drank as part of a ritualized competition. The drinking games weren't simply about letting loose and having fun after a raid or a victory. They were about proving bravery, endurance, and resilience, and the stakes were often much higher than you'd expect. These games were designed to test the strength of a warrior's spirit, mentally, emotionally, and physically. Picture this: after a hard-fought battle, warriors would gather, not just to drink but to face their fears, push their limits, and demonstrate their courage. But here's the surprising part: these drinking games weren't just about who could hold their liquor the longest or take the most shots. In fact, the real test was about enduring the emotional and psychological challenges of the game, which often involved risky stunts, challenges of physical endurance, and sometimes even personal insults meant to provoke. The Vikings didn't just drink to unwind, they drank to prove they could face any challenge, no matter how daunting. The games were often held in the presence of other warriors, so it became an opportunity for individuals to display their strength and honor. These weren't private affairs, but public tests of one's resolve, courage, and capacity to endure hardship. In a society where reputation and strength mattered above all, how one performed in these games could determine how they were viewed by their peers. Warriors who failed were seen as weak, while those who succeeded in the most grueling challenges earned respect, admiration, and higher social standing. What's even more shocking is that these competitions were seen as preparation for battle. You might assume that a warrior's training would be limited to physical combat, but the drinking games were just as much about preparing the mind as they were about testing physical limits. Imagine being in a life or death situation on the battlefield, facing enemies far stronger or more numerous than yourself. In those moments, it wasn't just physical strength that mattered. It was about mental toughness, resilience, and the ability to stay focused under pressure. These drinking games were designed to simulate that pressure, giving warriors a controlled environment to practice their mental fortitude before the real trials. But that's not the only surprising aspect of these rituals. Vikings believed that drinking itself had spiritual significance. You might think of their consumption of alcohol as a form of celebration, but it was also deeply connected to their spiritual world. Alcohol was often seen as a conduit through which warriors could connect with the gods, especially those associated with war, like Odin and Thor. Drinking wasn't just a social activity, it was a way of invoking divine favor. In this way, these games were also a form of sacred ritual, connecting the warriors to the spiritual world and reaffirming their connection to the gods before going into battle. The deeper connection between drinking, honor, and the spiritual realm reveals just how complex Viking society was. While today we might view drinking games as mere party tricks, for the Vikings, they were serious tests of character and endurance. They weren't about indulging in excess, they were about strengthening resolve, forging unbreakable bonds between warriors, and demonstrating one's worthiness to face the challenges of both battle and life. But there's a darker side to these rituals that often gets overlooked. Drinking games weren't just a test of courage, they were a way of proving one's worthiness to live. If a warrior couldn't handle the stress, if they faltered in the face of humiliation or the physical demands of the challenge, it was seen as a sign that they weren't ready to face the ultimate trials. This was a society that valued survival above all, and showing weakness, even in something as seemingly trivial as a drinking game, could have serious consequences. You might think this sounds brutal, but the truth is, these drinking games were an essential part of the Viking way of life. They weren't about revelry, they were about preparing warriors for the mental, physical, and spiritual trials they would face in battle. They were about showing that a true Viking could endure anything, face any challenge, and stand strong no matter what. And as much as we associate Vikings with berserkers and bloody battles, these drinking games remind us that the Vikings were also about mental discipline, honor, and community. The game served as a way to reinforce these values, ensuring that every warrior, whether on the battlefield or in daily life, could face the most difficult challenges without flinching. What's more, these games weren't just for men. Women too played a vital role in Viking society, and there were rituals for them that were just as intense and meaningful. But that's a story for another time. For now, remember this: the drinking games of the Vikings were more than just a test of alcohol tolerance. They were a test of everything that made a warrior strong. In these games, the line between myth and reality was blurred, and every gulp was a reminder that the Vikings were more than just fighters. They were survivors, warriors, and deeply spiritual people. Think Vikings just raided villages for treasure? A real feast was the heart of their culture. Feasts in Viking society weren't just about eating or celebrating. They were sacred rituals that honored gods and ancestors, and they played an essential role in Viking life. The feasts weren't simply social gatherings or opportunities to throw lavish parties. In fact, they were deeply spiritual events, tied to the Vikings' beliefs about the interconnectedness of life, death, and fate. The Viking feasts had a sacred purpose. The food served at these gatherings was symbolic, often representing fertility, strength, and the favor of the gods. What might seem like a simple meal was actually a way to invoke divine blessings and ensure prosperity for the people. For the Vikings, food wasn't just nourishment, it was a way to connect with the gods and secure their protection. The bread, the meat, the ale, it all had a specific meaning, and it was all part of a ritual that was larger than the food itself. It wasn't just about honoring the gods. The Vikings believed that their ancestors had a direct influence on their lives, and they made offerings during feasts to gain the favor of these spirits. This was a way to ensure that the ancestors' protection continued to guide and empower the living. The connection between the living and the dead was blurred in these feasts, as the Vikings felt that the presence of their ancestors still lingered at the table. The ancestral spirits were honored through specific rituals, such as the pouring of mead or the burning of incense, symbolizing respect and reverence. But it didn't stop there. The Viking feasts had a very real social and political function as well. They were where warriors could receive rewards and promotions. A Viking warrior's status was determined not only by their success in battle, but also by how they performed in these feasts. It wasn't enough to simply be a good fighter. A warrior had to prove themselves worthy of respect in these public communal settings. The feast provided a platform for these demonstrations of courage, strength, and leadership. If a warrior were seen as honorable in the eyes of their peers at the feast, their status in society could rise dramatically. The role of the Viking feasts in maintaining social cohesion cannot be overstated. Feasts were a time when different factions could come together, strengthen alliances, and solidify bonds between individuals and families. These gatherings were often marked by intense displays of loyalty, honor, and mutual respect. At the same time, they were also an opportunity for conflicts to be resolved or tensions to be eased, as there was a deep understanding that a strong and united community was essential for survival in the harsh Viking world. Feasts also played a crucial role in Viking warfare, as they were used to prepare warriors mentally and spiritually for the battles ahead. Now, imagine a group of warriors gathered around a massive fire, eating and drinking, the sound of their voices echoing through the night. It wasn't just a time for food, it was a time for strengthening resolve. This was the last chance to bond, reflect, and prepare before heading into battle. The food and drink were symbolic of the unity of the group, and they fortified the warriors' spirits as much as their bodies. What's even more surprising is that Viking feasts weren't just held after a victory, they were also an essential part of their religious calendar. These gatherings often aligned with key dates in the Viking year, such as the winter solstice or other seasonal transitions. These were times of great spiritual significance. By holding feasts at these points in the year, Vikings hoped to ensure their survival, prosperity, and good fortune in the year to come. The feasts were seen as a way of resetting the relationship between the living and the divine, ensuring that they had the gods' blessings for whatever lay ahead. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. These feasts weren't restricted to only close family or immediate allies. The Vikings sometimes invited strangers to join the feasts. In doing so, they extended their hospitality and symbolized unity with the wider community. This openness helped to foster alliances and friendships, and was a way of showing that the Vikings were not just fierce warriors, but also diplomatic and community-oriented people. The feasts, in this sense, were as much about politics as they were about religion and culture. The impact of these feasts on Viking society was profound. They weren't just a backdrop to Viking life, they were central to the way the Vikings maintained their sense of identity, cohesion, and power. These gatherings allowed them to honor their gods, celebrate their warriors, and reinforce the bonds that held their society together. They were an essential part of the Viking way of life, and their legacy can still be seen today in the way we think about celebration, community, and tradition. But there's a little-known fact that will make you rethink everything about Viking feasts. While the popular image of the Viking feast is one of loud revelry and drunken celebration, the truth is that these feasts were far more organized and structured than most people realized. There were specific rituals, customs, and even codes of conduct that governed how the feasts were held, who could attend, and what was expected of those present. It wasn't just about drinking and eating, it was about honoring the gods, maintaining social order, and ensuring the survival of the community. You might not have expected that the Viking feasts were so deeply structured, but the truth is, they were the beating heart of Viking society. They were where everything came together. The gods, the ancestors, the warriors, and the community. They were a way to ensure that the Vikings not only survived, but thrived. And they remain a testament to the complex and deeply spiritual nature of Viking culture. Ever heard of Viking magic? It wasn't just superstition, it was an essential part of their rituals. The Vikings practiced a form of magic called Satyr, and it was shrouded in mystery, often led by powerful women. You might think of magic as something from fairy tales, but for the Vikings, Satyr was an integral part of their culture and spirituality. Satyr was a form of shamanistic magic that involved chanting, spirit invocation, and ritual practices aimed at altering fate, gaining wisdom, or affecting the physical world. It was believed that practitioners could shape destiny itself through this powerful magic, which was particularly tied to the elements of nature, the gods, and the unseen forces in the world. Satyr wasn't just about casting spells. It was about connecting with the spiritual realm to bring about real-world change. The practice of Satyr was highly secretive, often performed by a chosen few who were believed to possess supernatural abilities. These practitioners were typically women, known as vulvas or seeresses, who held significant power in Viking society. This fact might surprise you. Despite the common image of Viking society being male-dominated, these women held roles that were central to Viking spiritual and political life. Their role was so powerful that it was feared and revered by Viking men and warriors alike. Satyr rituals were not simple incantations. They were complex, involving a combination of spoken words, chanting, and sometimes the use of hallucinogenic substances instances to enhance spiritual visions. These rituals often took place in sacred groves or during the dead of night, adding an air of mystery and secrecy. What's intriguing is that the practice wasn't just for divination. Sadraur was also used to manipulate fate itself. For example, it was believed that practitioners could curse an enemy or bless a warrior before battle, influencing the outcome of the fight. You might be thinking, is this just a superstition, or was there more to it? The truth is, Sadraur was deeply connected to the Viking worldview, which was based on the belief that the future wasn't set in stone. The Vikings believed in a constantly shifting fate, shaped by both human actions and divine intervention. Sadraur provided a means to tap into that flow of fate, allowing practitioners to intervene and shift events. It wasn't about controlling the future. It was about aligning oneself with the forces of the cosmos. The power of Sadraur was so significant that it was considered dangerous. In fact, the word Sadur itself is tied to an ancient Norse root meaning to sway or to shift, highlighting the idea of shifting events in favor of the practitioner or their clan. However, such power didn't come without a price. Those who practiced Sadraur were sometimes seen as dangerous, and there were strong social taboos against certain kinds of magic. For example, practicing Sadraur was sometimes seen as unmanly in Viking society, leading to the disapproval of male warriors who felt it threatened their sense of masculinity. This taboo is quite striking. A practice that held such power and importance was also viewed with suspicion by the very people who depended on it. The real danger of Sadraur lay in the belief that the power to alter fate could also backfire. If they made a mistake or used their power recklessly, it was believed that the consequences could be disastrous. This deep-seated fear of unraveling fate highlights the fragile balance that the Vikings believed existed between the human and divine worlds. It wasn't just about changing events, it was about ensuring that the changes made were in harmony with the natural order. If a practitioner disrupted that order, they risked angering the gods or causing the universe to collapse into chaos. What's even more fascinating is how Viking society viewed the use of Sadraur in the context of war. Vikings didn't just rely on brute force to win battles. They also believed in the power of spiritual intervention. The use of Sadraur was considered an essential part of preparing for battle. In some cases, warriors would seek out a vulva to perform rituals that would ensure their success on the battlefield. It wasn't uncommon for warriors to approach these spiritual leaders for blessings, hoping that the divine power they invoked would tip the scales in their favor. This belief that spiritual practices could have tangible outcomes in war demonstrates just how intertwined Viking culture was with the mystical and the supernatural. Sadraur didn't only focus on battle, though. It was used for a variety of purposes, including healing, fertility, and prophecy. The Vikings believed that Sadraur could be used to cure illness or improve a person's chances of bearing children, both of which were vital concerns in their harsh environment. If a Viking community was struggling with infertility or sickness, a seer might be called upon to perform a ritual to appease the gods or spirits and restore balance to the people. It's hard to grasp just how much Sadraur permeated Viking society. It wasn't just a fringe belief, it was a central part of how the Vikings understood their place in the world. For the Vikings, the supernatural wasn't separate from the natural. It was a part of everything. The belief in Sadraur was so strong that it was institutionalized in certain ways. Viking leaders, like kings and chieftains, would sometimes keep a vulva by their side to advise them during critical decisions. It was a spiritual safety net, ensuring that any major decision was in line with divine will. Sadraur is a perfect example of how Viking culture was deeply rooted in their beliefs about fate and the divine. The use of magic wasn't about manipulating the gods for personal gain. It was about aligning with the forces that governed the universe. The vulvas were not seen as mere fortune tellers. They were respected figures whose powers were believed to come from the gods themselves. Their rituals were a way for the Vikings to ensure that their actions were in harmony with the larger cosmic order. You might be wondering, what happened to Sadraur over time? As Christianity began to spread throughout Scandinavia, many of the old pagan practices, including Sadraur, were suppressed or marginalized. But even though Sadraur was no longer practiced openly, its influence continued to echo throughout Viking culture, with remnants of its beliefs seeping into folklore and stories. What's remarkable is that, even today, there are modern interpretations of Sadraur that aim to revive the ancient practices. This connection between the old ways and modern spiritual practices shows just how lasting the impact of Viking rituals like Sadraur truly was. In conclusion, Sadraur was far more than just a form of magic. It was a vital part of the Viking worldview, a means to manipulate fate, connect with the gods, and maintain balance in a chaotic world. It's a fascinating glimpse into a culture that blended the supernatural with the everyday, where magic and fate were as real as the sword in a warrior's hand. What might seem like ancient superstition to us was a powerful tool for the Vikings, shaping their society, their leaders, and their very destiny. What do you know about the Valkyries? These mystical figures weren't just warrior women. They were the divine guides of fallen heroes, leading them to their eternal reward in Valhalla. But their role was much deeper than the heroic myths suggest. Valkyries were believed to be the hands of fate. They had the power to choose which warriors would live and which would die in battle. Their decisions weren't arbitrary. They were seen as part of a divine plan set in motion by the gods. But how did they make these decisions? What did their rituals truly involve? Let's dive deeper into the role of the Valkyries and their fascinating rituals. The Valkyries weren't simply warriors. They were spiritual figures figures, heavily involved in rituals that aligned the fate of warriors with the will of the gods. Their task was to choose the bravest, most worthy warriors who died in battle and lead them to Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain. But how did they select these warriors? Was it based on personal merit or divine intervention? The truth is, it was a combination of both. Valkyries acted as intermediaries between the mortal and divine worlds, channeling the will of the gods and ensuring that the chosen warriors reached their rightful afterlife. They were linked with Odin, the chief of the gods who ruled over Valhalla. These warrior women weren't just passive participants in the afterlife. They played an active role in deciding the future of those who died bravely. The Valkyries were intimately connected with the spiritual realm, and their power went far beyond merely selecting fallen warriors. The rituals of the Valkyries were central to Viking beliefs about death and the afterlife. These women would often perform rites that involved preparing the souls of warriors for their journey to Valhalla. This wasn't just a ceremonial task, it was a spiritual responsibility, one that carried significant weight within Viking culture. The Valkyries weren't seen as ordinary women. They were revered, almost feared, for their ability to control the fates of warriors. The rituals surrounding the Valkyries were often tied to their connection with the gods. In some stories, the Valkyries were said to be daughters of Odin himself, while in others, they were seen as his servants, tasked with carrying out his will. But what's truly fascinating is how these figures blurred the lines between mortality and divinity. The Valkyries were both human and divine, embodying the qualities of both warriors and spirits. Their rituals involved both physical and spiritual preparation. The Valkyries had to be strong, courageous women, trained in battle and leadership, but they also had to be spiritually attuned to the gods, ready to carry out the divine will. This duality is one of the most intriguing aspects of their role. It wasn't enough to be a great warrior. To be a Valkyrie, you had to be both a physical and spiritual leader. Interestingly, the selection of fallen warriors wasn't just about heroism in battle. It was also about the worthiness of the warrior's soul. The Valkyries weren't simply picking the strongest fighters. They were choosing those whose deaths aligned with the greater cosmic plan of the gods. This idea adds a layer of mystery to their role. The warrior's fate wasn't just determined by how well they fought. It was determined by the divine forces that guided the Valkyries' choices. And yet, despite their revered position, the Valkyries were often portrayed in a mysterious light. Some Viking sagas depict them as almost ethereal beings, capable of transforming into swans or other animals, further blurring the line between human and divine. This ability to shapeshift reflects their power over both life and death. The Valkyries were not merely passive figures. They were active agents of fate, shaping the course of history with every battle they witnessed. The connection between the Valkyries and death rituals also extended to the Viking burial customs, and warriors who were chosen to enter Valhalla were often given elaborate funerals, sometimes even with sacrifices. The Valkyries were thought to guide these souls, ensuring they were prepared for their new life in the afterlife. This process wasn't just symbolic, it was a sacred task that marked the transition of a warrior from the mortal world to the divine. What's truly surprising is how this myth of the Valkyries ties into Viking views on honor and the afterlife. The Vikings didn't view death as an end, but as a transformation into something greater. A warrior's life was a journey, and the Valkyries were the gods who ensured that journey ended in eternal glory. The ritual of preparing these souls for Valhalla was as much about ensuring honor in life as it was about rewarding bravery in death. But what happens if a warrior wasn't chosen by the Valkyries? The Vikings believed that those who weren't selected would enter Hell, the land of the dead. While this wasn't necessarily a bad place, it wasn't the glorious afterlife that warriors fought for. This adds an element of uncertainty to the Viking view of fate. The Valkyries' choice wasn't just a matter of who was brave, it was about who had earned their place in the divine afterlife. Truth is, the Valkyries weren't just about choosing who lived or died, they were about ensuring that death had meaning. Every warrior who died in battle had the potential for eternal glory, and it was the Valkyries who decided who was worthy of that fate. They were, in essence, the final arbiters of a warrior's legacy. This sacred responsibility elevated the Valkyries to a position of immense power, one that went beyond simple mythological figures. Perhaps the most fascinating part of the Valkyries' rituals is how they influenced Viking society itself. These women were seen as symbols of strength, bravery, and spiritual power. They were not just warriors, they were leaders who shaped the destiny of the warriors who followed them. The Valkyries were revered not just for their role in the afterlife, but for their embodiment of the values that Viking society held dear: courage, honor. In conclusion, the Valkyries were much more than just mythological figures. Their rituals were central to the Viking understanding of death, fate, and honor. Through their sacred duties, the Valkyries played an essential role in shaping Viking society, not just by leading the dead to Valhalla, but by reinforcing the ideals that defined the Vikings as a culture. The surprising depth of their power and influence will challenge your view of Viking mythology and make you reconsider what it truly means to be a hero. You might think that the Vikings were all about their gods and their battles, but there was something that was even more sacred to them: their sacred oak. It wasn't just another tree, it was a symbol of their deepest connection to the divine forces they revered. This oak wasn't just the centerpiece of a physical landscape, it was a spiritual anchor, with rituals surrounding it that could shape the very course of their lives. The Vikings believed that the sacred oak was a direct link to Thor, the thunder god, who was considered the protector of mankind. It wasn't just a tree in the forest, it was a spiritual nexus, revered for its power to bless the land with fertility, ensure prosperity, and protect the people from evil forces. Imagine that, a simple tree holding the weight of the god's power in the mortal world. The rituals surrounding this sacred oak were elaborate and carried significant meaning. Every year, the Vikings would gather around the oak for ceremonies designed to strengthen their ties to the divine. These rituals often involved offerings, typically food, drink, or sacrifices, to ensure the god's favor. You might think of these offerings as simple religious acts, but they were far more than that. These rituals symbolized the Vikings' belief that the forces of nature could either bless them or curse them. The oak, as a sacred object, was central to that balance. But what's most surprising about the sacred oak ritual isn't just the tree itself, it's how the Vikings connected this oak to their everyday lives. The trees were believed to hold immense power, able to influence everything from fertility to the success of harvests. In fact, some of these rituals were held during seasonal transitions, such as the end of winter, the start of spring, or the harvest season, marking a way of honoring the changing cycles of nature. But the rituals didn't just look backward, they were forward-facing, ensuring prosperity for generations to come. What might surprise you is the idea that these rituals weren't just for the elite. Everyone, from warriors to farmers, took part in the sacred rituals surrounding the oak. If you were a Viking, it was crucial to be connected to this life force. The connection wasn't just ceremonial, it was practical too. The sacred oak was viewed as the protector of not just spiritual matters, but also the very material wealth of the people. It wasn't uncommon for important decisions, such as where to settle, how to farm, or when to raid, to be made during these rituals, with the oak's divine protection sought for guidance. In this way, it tied together the Vikings' spiritual, political, and social life. This brings us to a curious fact. While we often associate Viking gods with war and battle, many of their most sacred rituals were actually about agriculture and nature. It might be shocking to think that the Vikings, often depicted as fierce warriors, also saw the sacred oak as a symbol of life, growth, and peace. They believed that, just as the oak tree grew and gave life, so too would their fortunes grow if they honored it properly. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. While the oak itself was revered in all its natural beauty, there was a darker side to its symbolism. The Viking belief in the oak tree was tied to ideas of sacrifice. Sacrifices that could include offerings of both animals and, in rare cases, humans. These sacrifices weren't intended as mere appeasements. They were believed to be an essential way of ensuring the continued strength and fertility of the land. In fact, the oak tree was so deeply entwined with the fate of the Vikings that it was said to have the power to alter the future itself. But here's the real kicker. The sacred oak was not just a spiritual center, it was a place of deep personal transformation. There were rumors that the Vikings would sometimes take part in rituals involving sacred knowledge passed down from generation to generation. This knowledge was said to be hidden within the oak itself. Those who were initiated into the secret rites of the oak could gain wisdom that would help them lead their people to greatness, or even give them the power to interpret dreams or visions from the gods. And then there's the idea that these rituals were so powerful that they lasted well beyond the Vikings' time. Many of these oak-centered practices influenced later Norse customs and even shaped Viking iconography. While the oak's rituals have mostly faded from view, their influence can still be felt in some modern interpretations of Viking culture. Even in present-day depictions of Viking society, the sacred oak stands as a symbol of strength, protection, and the connection between man and the divine. You may be surprised to learn that many of the beliefs surrounding the sacred oak still persist today. The oak tree, with its deep roots and towering presence, continues to symbolize endurance and resilience in many cultures. While the original rituals have been long forgotten, the deep respect for the oak symbolism is still alive and well. So, the next time you see an oak tree standing tall, remember that it once represented much more than just a tree to the Vikings. It was a living link between the gods and man, a conduit of life, and a reminder of the eternal cycle that ties all living things together. You might think rune casting is just a random superstition, a form of fortune-telling, but it's much more profound and central to Viking society than you can imagine. Rune casting was far from being a simple game or a fortune-teller's trick. In fact, it was a ritual tied directly to decision-making, leadership, and the very fate of the Vikings. The Vikings believed that runes were not mere symbols, but powerful magical characters that held the secrets of the universe. Each rune had its own distinct meaning, capable of influencing not just personal fates, but the collective destiny of entire Viking clans. This wasn't a casual practice, it was deeply tied to Viking leadership and spiritual belief. Every rune casting ritual was a way of asking the gods for guidance and ensuring the correct path was chosen. Now, what might surprise you is how these runes weren't just about good luck or curses. They were used to shape decisions that affected the Viking community. Before important battles, raids, or even voyages, Viking leaders would often cast runes. This ritual was considered an act of divine consultation. The casting wasn't just a form of prayer, it was an interaction with the divine powers believed to rule over the Vikings' lives. Imagine placing your future and your warriors' lives into the hands of an ancient system of symbols, trusting that the gods would guide your decisions. But the real magic of the runes lies in their connection to fate. The Vikings held a unique view of time and destiny. They believed that fate was both predetermined and changeable, something that could be influenced by their actions in life. This is where rune casting became a form of spiritual intervention. It wasn't just a ceremonial practice. It was a way to alter the flow of destiny itself. What was a simple yes or no could become a matter of life and death, especially if a wrong decision was made. You might find it surprising that the act of casting runes wasn't solely performed by the highest leaders, like kings or chieftains. Even ordinary Vikings could participate in rune casting rituals. In fact, it was often the spiritual leaders, the seers and shamans, who performed these rites, but it was a collective experience. The entire community, especially during pivotal times like the winter solstice or important harvests, would be involved. It was a way of communing with the gods, seeking their favor or warning them about potential disasters. When the Viking world was so connected to nature, the belief that one could influence the divine with these symbols was a deeply held truth. At the heart of the rune casting ritual was a belief in the profound power of symbols. The Vikings didn't just see the runes as magical words. They saw them as living, breathing forces that could be wielded by those who understood their meaning. It wasn't about luck. It was about harnessing power, control over one's own fate, and a connection to the spiritual world. But the real kicker here is that the runes were often used for divination in daily life, helping people decide everything from marriage proposals to the location of settlements. There's also a controversial aspect to rune casting, the use of the runes to influence or control others. The Vikings didn't just cast runes for guidance, they used them for power. If a leader was about to make a crucial decision that could change the course of their clan, they might cast the runes, but with a specific question in mind. This wasn't just divination, it was a tactic for manipulating outcomes to their benefit. For example, if a Viking chief was considering an alliance or war, they could use the runes to strengthen their position by invoking the favor of gods associated with strength, victory, or wisdom. Some believe that this ritualized form of decision-making was not only a tool of leadership but also a means of consolidating power. Viking leaders were often seen as semi-divine figures, chosen by the gods themselves to lead. This belief in their divine favor was reinforced by the practice of rune casting. It wasn't just the rune caster's wisdom that guided the people, it was the belief that the gods themselves were speaking through the runes, making the act of ruling a more spiritual and unquestioned process. What's truly fascinating, though, is how the casting of runes links the Vikings to their broader worldview. They weren't merely warriors or raiders, they were deeply spiritual individuals, tied to an ancient understanding of the cosmos. The runes were believed to reflect a cosmic order, an interconnected web of fate, and the Vikings saw themselves as part of that great web. Every action, every decision, no matter how small, was seen as part of a much larger and far-reaching plan. You might be thinking that the magic of runes was mostly a religious practice, used only by the spiritually inclined, but that's not the case. Rune casting, especially in battle, was also a way of strengthening Viking resolve. It wasn't just about asking the gods for favor, it was about mentally and emotionally preparing warriors for what lay ahead. The physical act of casting the runes became a communal ritual that unified the Vikings, giving them a collective sense of purpose and conviction. But perhaps the most important aspect of rune casting was how it revealed the true power of the Vikings, their belief in fate and destiny. To the Vikings, fate wasn't just something they accepted, it was something they could change. It was in their hands, shaped by their own actions and the will of the gods. By casting the runes, they were not simply accepting the future, they were actively engaging with it, reshaping it to their own will. The most shocking truth about rune casting is that it wasn't just an ancient practice, it still resonates today. While we no longer use runes to influence decisions or consult the gods, the concept of using symbols or rituals to bring clarity to our decisions has a direct link to this ancient tradition. Whether through modern-day rituals, mindfulness practices, or even decision-making processes, we continue to see clarity in similar ways. So, while the runes may no longer be used as divination tools for Viking leadership, their legacy still shapes how we approach fate, spirituality, and decision-making. What was once a mystical act tied to gods and warriors is now a part of how we approach life's uncertainties. And if there's one thing the Vikings understood better than anyone else, it's that we all have the power to shape our own destiny, just like they did with the power of the runes. You probably think Viking births were like any other, right? In a sense, that's true. Birth was an incredibly vital part of Viking society, just like any other culture. But the way the Vikings approached childbirth was unlike anything you might expect. For them, birth wasn't just a physical process. It was a sacred event, steeped in rituals that connected the new life to the favor of the gods and the fate of the family. In Viking culture, the birth of a child wasn't just about ensuring the survival of the next generation. It was about aligning the child with destiny. The Vikings believed that fate wasn't just something you accepted, it was something you actively shaped, and birth was a key part of this belief system. The child's arrival had to be prepared for spiritually, physically, and mentally. One ritual that may surprise you is how the mother's body was ritually prepared. The process wasn't just about cleanliness or comfort, it was about making sure that the child's entry into the world would be blessed by the gods. The mother would be given a sacred space, sometimes even surrounded by specific symbols or blessings. What's more, the pregnant woman herself was considered to be under the protection of divine forces forces, both for her safety and for the child's. There were prayers, chants, and offerings that were made to secure a smooth delivery, to ensure that the child would grow strong and healthy, and to protect both the child and the mother from any supernatural harm. But it's not just the mother who was honored during this ritual. The father's role was also crucial. While the mother was seen as the vessel for new life, the father was expected to prove his worth through symbolic actions, often taking part in rituals to ensure that the child would have a bright future. The Vikings believed that children weren't just born into a family, they were born into the world of the gods, and therefore everything about their entrance into the world had to be aligned with divine favor. Now what's really fascinating is how the Vikings saw birth as a way to tie the child to the gods and the natural world. The sacredness of the process was deeply tied to their views on fate. There were rituals that connected the birth of a child to elements of nature, whether it be water, fire, or the earth, believing that the child's life would be inextricably tied to these forces. The belief in these natural forces as guides was rooted in a deep spiritual connection with the world around them. If you've ever heard of the Norse concept of Yggdrasil, the world tree, you'll understand how this idea shaped Viking views on life, death, and rebirth. Here's where things get even more interesting. The Vikings weren't just concerned with the child's survival and health, they were concerned about its destiny. The birth didn't just signify the beginning of life, it was the start of the child's journey into the world of the gods and into their family's future. One of the most interesting rituals involved the giving of the child's name. The name wasn't just a label, it was a key that unlocked the child's role in the grand narrative of the Viking world. Names were carefully chosen to reflect the child's destiny, whether they would be a warrior, a healer, a leader, or a ruler. The naming ceremony was believed to be a way of invoking the gods' favor, as well as a way to guide the child on its path in life. But the spiritual aspects didn't end with the birth itself. As the child grew, the Vikings held other rites to mark significant milestones, each one tying the child further into the world of gods and spirit. These rituals were performed to ensure that the child would grow strong, courageous, and in tune with the natural world. They were all part of a spiritual blueprint that would help the child fulfill its role in Viking society. You might be surprised to learn that some of these birth rituals were believed to have an effect on the child's future greatness. If a child was born during a full moon, or if certain omens were present, the birth was seen as particularly auspicious, marking the child as destined for something extraordinary. But there was also a darker side to these beliefs. If the birth was troubled, if there were complications, or if the child appeared weak, it was believed that the gods had given a sign that the child's life might be filled with hardship, or that it was not meant for greatness. This concept of fate being shaped through rituals is something we've come to understand better through Norse mythology. The Norns, the three goddesses of fate, were believed to weave the threads of life for every individual, deciding the course of their existence. The act of birth and the rituals surrounding it were thought to directly influence these threads, pulling them in a favorable direction. But what's especially intriguing is that while the Vikings believed in fate, they also believed in the power to change it. Through rituals, sacrifices, and rites of passage, they thought it was possible to alter the course of one's destiny. This was especially true when it came to warrior children. The Vikings believed that some children were destined to become leaders, while others were marked to fight in battle. There were even rites performed before a child was old enough to walk, to instill in them the characteristics of a great warrior: bravery, strength, and an unshakable connection to the gods. These ceremonies were designed not only to shape the child's future, but to prepare them to carry out the will of the gods and their ancestors. If there's one thing you take away from this, it's this. For the Vikings, birth wasn't just the start of a new life, it was the beginning of a journey that connected the child with the gods, fate, and the natural world. The rituals around birth show just how deeply spiritual Viking society was, and how they saw themselves as part of a much larger cosmic story. The idea of destiny was ever present in Viking culture, and they believed that every life, every birth, was a continuation of the divine narrative of the gods. This might sound far removed from our own modern-day practices, but there's something universal in it. The Vikings showed us that how we enter the world isn't just a biological event, it's a spiritual one too. The legacy of their birth rituals continues to resonate today, as we all continue to seek meaning and connection in the world we live in. Ever wondered why the Vikings celebrated Yule with such passion? You might picture it as just a winter celebration, but it was far more than that. Yule marked the end of the cold, dark winter and the rebirth of the sun, a time when life itself was symbolically reborn. The Vikings viewed this festival as crucial to their survival, not just as a fun break from the harshness of winter. They believed it was a time to honor the gods, secure their favor, and ensure the continued prosperity of their people. The central part of this festival was a series of sacrifices. Unlike modern-day celebrations, where we're accustomed to gifts and feasts, Yule involved making offerings to the gods, ensuring that their favor was secured for the coming year. This wasn't just about food or drink, it was about giving back to the gods in a very personal and spiritual way. The offerings weren't limited to animals, but could also involve symbolic gestures meant to represent the sacrifice of personal belongings, prosperity, or even the life of a chosen person. Here's an interesting twist. Yule wasn't just about giving thanks, it was about balancing the scales. The Vikings saw winter as a harsh time, one where survival itself was a struggle. As a result, Yule rituals had a deep connection connection to fertility and the renewal of life. It was believed that the gods needed to be reminded of their duty to ensure fertility in both the land and the people. If the gods didn't receive the proper offerings, there was a belief that the next harvest might fail, or that the coming season would bring destruction instead of growth. It's a belief rooted in the connection between human survival and the spiritual balance maintained through ritual. The feasts and sacrifices were full of meaning. Everything from the food served to the music played had a symbolic function. The Vikings believed that food was more than sustenance. It was a way of connecting with the gods. The meats offered were often symbolic of strength, fertility, and the renewal of life. During these celebrations, families would also perform rituals meant to ensure fertility and prosperity for the following year. This wasn't just a time for merriment. It was a moment for every Viking to reflect on the challenges of the past year and actively work to ensure the future would be better. What might really surprise you is how much the celebration of Yule influenced our modern-day Christmas traditions. For instance, the burning of a Yule log was a significant ritual. The fire symbolized the rebirth of the sun and was a way to ensure light would return after the dark winter. Some believe the Yule log even helped lay the groundwork for our modern Christmas tree tradition. The Vikings believed that by burning the log, they were symbolically burning away the darkness, ensuring that the new year would be filled with light and vitality. And there's more. The Yule festival had a powerful social function as well. It wasn't just about honoring the gods, it was also about strengthening bonds within Viking communities. There was a communal aspect to these rituals, where everyone, from leaders to commoners, participated in the same ceremonies. The Yule festival brought people together, reminding them of their shared survival in a harsh world, and reinforced social ties. You might even say that the festival's rituals were about affirming unity and survival, something that was vital in Viking society, where strength in numbers could mean life or death. But did you know that the Vikings took this celebration a step further? It was believed that Yule wasn't just about securing the gods' favor for prosperity in the coming year, but about ensuring the future of the Viking people themselves. Families would place great importance on having children around Yule, believing that a child born during this time was blessed by the gods and would grow up to be strong and courageous. Even Viking leaders participated in rituals to renew their commitment to their people and their gods. This wasn't simply about keeping the cold at bay. It was a spiritual reminder that the Vikings believed their fates were intertwined with the forces of nature and the gods they honored. The Vikings knew that they were only part of a much larger cosmic story, and the Yule festival was their way of actively participating in it. By performing rituals, making sacrifices, and honoring the gods, they believed they were shaping their destiny. The rituals surrounding Yule were far more than festive traditions. They were a means of survival, a way to connect with the divine, and a way to ensure that the cycles of nature continued to favor their way of life. Yule for the Vikings was about hope and renewal, but also about the survival of the gods' gifts. These ancient rituals, filled with symbolic acts, helped the Vikings understand their place in the world. The spiritual rebirth that they celebrated each winter was tied directly to their everyday survival. When the days were darkest, they turned to the gods to bring back the sun and ensure prosperity for the future. So, what might seem like a simple holiday to us today, just a winter celebration or even a party, was in fact an essential part of Viking spirituality. It was about affirming life in the face of darkness, renewing strength and unity, and securing divine favor to ensure a prosperous year ahead. It's a reminder of how deeply connected the Vikings were to their environment and their gods, and how rituals like these provided meaning and hope in a harsh world. These rituals were more than just traditions. They were vital to their understanding of fate, survival, and community. The Yule festival ritual stands as a testament to the complex relationship the Vikings had with the gods and the world around them. Through their rituals, they made sense of a world that was constantly in flux and often beyond their control. Think kings were untouchable in Viking society? Well, think again. The Viking kings sometimes had to offer themselves as a sacrifice, not just to ensure their own legacy, but for the prosperity of the entire kingdom. In fact, a sacrificial act was far more than a symbolic gesture. It was a key part of their leadership. It wasn't about ruling with power or force. It was about demonstrating spiritual worth. This concept may sound surprising, even unsettling, but it was deeply rooted in Viking culture and beliefs. The king's role was not just political, it was spiritual. This idea of sacrifice extended beyond mere ritual. Kings would have to prove their worthiness, often undergoing trials or sacrifices that were designed to show their commitment to the well-being of the land. The trials they faced were seen as a reflection of their bond with the gods, and their willingness to sacrifice their own well-being for the greater good was considered essential for the prosperity of their people. The idea that the king must offer himself for the benefit of the land ties into the Vikings' broader worldview. The gods and the earth were inextricably linked, and the health of the land was thought to reflect the health of the king. This concept of the king as the protector of both the physical and spiritual realm meant that, in times of great need, the king's own life might have to be sacrificed to maintain balance. It was believed that if a king failed in his duty, the land itself could suffer, crops might fail, people might starve, and the Viking community could be thrown into chaos. One rare and surprising fact is that these sacrifices were sometimes carried out publicly. Kings could perform their sacrifices in front of their people, showcasing their own submission to the god. This was seen as an act of ultimate humility humility and courage, proving to their subjects that they were willing to give everything for the prosperity of their realm. Contrary to what we might imagine, these rituals weren't a way for the king to die. Rather, they were about ensuring the kingdom's future. The king had to show that he was connected to both the gods and the earth, and that he had the spiritual power to lead his people through any crisis. What might also surprise you is how much the concept of sacrifice influenced Viking kingship. It wasn't just about the power to rule, it was about understanding fate and destiny. Viking kings believed that their fate was intertwined with the land they ruled. If they didn't perform these spiritual acts, the kingdom could fall into ruin. This wasn't just a matter of symbolism, it was seen as a direct link between the king's leadership and the health of the kingdom. Now, what about the kings who didn't perform these sacrifices? The reality is, the king's failure to uphold this spiritual connection could lead to disastrous consequences. Some Viking kings who were seen as neglecting these duties were replaced, either through political coups or even by other warriors who believed they were more spiritually worthy. This shows just how deeply the Vikings connected leadership with spirituality. It wasn't about raw power, but about balance, fate, and death. The ultimate irony of this ritual is that, despite the outward display of sacrifice, the king wasn't meant to die in most cases. In fact, some rituals were designed to make the king appear as though he were offering his life, only to emerge as a symbol of rebirth. These rituals, though, served to ensure that the king remained in power, not by force, but by demonstrating his spiritual and physical connection to the gods. The rituals were meant to prepare the land and the people for a prosperous future, through a king who demonstrated his devotion and spiritual worth. These practices offer a unique perspective on Viking leadership. It wasn't simply about power or brute strength, it was about proving to both the gods and the people that the king was worthy of the land. By undergoing these sacrificial rituals, the Viking kings maintained their legitimacy, ensuring that they were spiritually aligned with the forces of nature and the divine will of the gods. The role of the king was much more complex than we might imagine. It wasn't just about managing the kingdom, it was about becoming a bridge between the gods, the land, and the people. So, next time you think about Viking kings, don't just picture them sitting on a throne, commanding armies. Picture them standing at the edge of a cliff, ready to sacrifice everything for the good of their people, in a spiritual act that would ensure the kingdom's survival. The Viking kings understood the weight of their position. It wasn't just about ruling, it was about being the spiritual protector of the land, with the fate of the kingdom resting on their shoulders. What you may have thought about Viking kingship isn't the full story. It's not just about glory and power, it's about sacrifice, spiritual connection, and the understanding that leadership is not just a political role, but one tied to the very fate of the land and the people you lead. This complex web of spirituality, fate, and leadership shaped Viking society in ways we are only beginning to fully understand. The Viking kings knew that their prosperity was tied to their spiritual connection, and the sacrifice of their own selves wasn't just symbolic, it was essential to their success and survival. If you enjoyed this epic journey, please subscribe to our channel for more thrilling historical tales. Don't miss out on new videos. Hit the notification bell to stay updated.